The latest inflation figures released by the Ghana Statistical Service, and the rate for the month of April has jumped to 10.6% from 7.8%. In March, we are told is the highest in 8 months. Now, the recent astronomical hikes in prices of food items amid the COVID-19 pandemic, coupled with partial lockdown effected for 3 weeks, were factors that contributed to this jump. Samuel Kobna-Enim is government statistician.
Ladies and gentlemen, we share with you CPI and rate of inflation for the month of April 2020. CPI for April 2020 was 116.6 relative to 113.0 in the month of March 2020. This culminates in 3.2 month-on-month inflation that is between March 2020 and April 2020. On a year-on-year basis, this translates into a 10.6 change in general price levels over the month of April 2019 and the month of April 2020. This means that in the month of April 2020, the general price level was 10.6% higher than April 2019. We do the disaggregation based on source by sharing with you the food inflation and the non-food inflation. And food inflation for the month of April 2020 was 14.4 relative to 7.7 for non-food inflation. Because of the special circumstance that we find ourselves in, we give you a sense of the average food inflation over the past 8 months preceding April 2020. That is from the month of April 2019 to the month of March 2020. And we see that averagely it was about 7.9% from August 2019 to March 2020. So the difference between the average of the past 8 months and the month of April 2020 is 6.5%. In contrast to the spike for food inflation, we see a slight drop in non-food inflation by comparing the average from the month of August 2019 to March 2020, which we recorded 7.8% relative to 7.7% for the month of April 2020. From a locally produced perspective and an imported commodity perspective, we realize that locally produced items was 13.1% and inflation for food items was 4.9%. This is attributed to the fact that food inflation that is driving inflation for the month of April 2020 is largely locally produced oriented. We give you further disaggregation by highlighting on the impact of food inflation from both a year-on-year perspective and a month-on-month perspective. From a year-on-year perspective, we see that the contribution of food inflation was 60%, whereas from a month-on-month perspective, the contribution of food inflation was more than 4/5, specifically 82.5%, which means that the contribution of food inflation to the 10.6 inflation that we reported earlier on was driven largely, that is 4/5 of it, between increases in prices of food from the month of March 2020 to April 2020.
Government statistician Professor Samuel Kobna-Enim breaking down the figures for us at a press briefing earlier today. Joining me for a conversation around this is economist with Data Bank Research, Courage Boti. Courage, great to have you this afternoon. We saw this coming, the highest inflation rate in 8 months amid the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns. This was expected, wasn't it?
Yeah, certainly expected. Good afternoon to your listeners. If you see our attitudes, and understandably so, ahead of the lockdown, where a lot of people have to flood the market to stock their homes. One, because we don't know how long the lockdown was going to be. And then, of course, the market remains also cashing on the situation. Well, definitely there will be a supply shock from that angle. And from a basic demand supply analysis, obviously prices are supposed to go up. We all experienced it. The price of on a longer of Gary that ordinarily would have been around 7-8 cedis shot up to as much as 25 cedis. We've seen tubers of yam ordinarily that were 5 cedis thereabout in the regions of 20-25 cedis. We all experience it. So I think that is really what is translating into the higher prices we are seeing and the higher inflation we're seeing for the month of April. And understandably so is driven largely by the food component, which actually has been the major driver of inflation for some time now. we see for the month that the food group alone contributed about 60% to the total inflation print for the month. And that is, speaking to what we saw in the month of April.
And what are the implications of this single jump to 10.6% on our economy, looking at the fact that we are not yet done with the COVID-19 pandemic?
This will not persist. I think this is a one-off situation. Probably the May print will also show something slightly higher or just around the current level, but thereafter it should come down. It should come down because it was an anomaly induced by the lockdown where prices had to soar. But we saw that immediately after the lockdown, even the 2 weeks after, when you go to the market, things that were selling at very absurd prices came down quite considerably. So with that effect out, in say 2-3 months' time, we should see inflation reverting to around the midpoint of the medium-term target of the 8% level. So we do not expect this hike to be sustained or even higher levels going forward. We think it's an anomaly or it's something caused by the situation we found ourselves in. And once that corrects and that effect is off the computation, we should see inflation revert to where it ought to be ultimately. And that also tells us that, of course, the Monetary Policy Committee will decide on the policy rate soon with the kind of inflation we have. And given that under the circumstances, banks are not too willing to lend because of the risk of accumulating non-performing loans, it will not be prudent for the Bank of Ghana on even the liquidity caution alone or liquidity side alone to want to ease the monetary policy rate. And now that inflation has jumped to where it is now, if care is not taken and you add extra liquidity to the system, what you might do is you must spiral inflation to the upside, which nobody wants at this point. So we are expecting that when the Bank of Ghana meets, somewhere along the week, or I think, they should be holding the monetary policy rate where it is now.
Okay, so you're expecting that the MPC will hold the rate, but let me get this right. So we've seen that the lockdown restrictions have been eased, and we've seen that businesses have returned, people are operating now. Chances that this 10.6 may change, how significantly?
Say that again.
So I was asking, seeing that businesses have returned, the lockdowns have restrictions have been eased, how significant will we see the change in the next briefing by the Statistical Service on our inflation rate?
I would have to, this was released not long ago. I would have to do the computations, to reach a fair idea on where it could be next month. But my back of the envelope estimation will be that, of course, the price jump is actually correcting and corrected almost immediately. Not completely, but there was some significant correction. And then, of course, with all companies opening up and then production, we can't meet the production lag or the supply lag immediately because a chunk of the stuff that need to be imported also could not come in because of the COVID and then the lockdown the restrictions on travels and all of that. So and I think Guta warned us about this, sometime earlier in March there about that. They are unable to import, and then with this COVID situation, it's going to lead in jumping prices. So there will not be immediate recovery towards the 7.8 we were, but we could be seeing something around the 8% level in the next 2-3 months.
Okay, and a quick one, just because it came up yesterday, the finance minister has been tasked to come up with an economic recovery plan, and looking at the figures that are not looking so good right now, where does he start from?
Well, the recovery should be targeting sectors that can turn around quickly. I understand that, virtually every sector has taken a hit from this COVID. Agriculture, trade, manufacturing, whatever, hospitality, everyone. My question is this time to be doing long-term investments that its return will be seen in 2, 3, 4 years' time? Because what we need now is the investments that can keep jobs, investments that can boost our domestic production levels. I think we had a good start from the investment in the pharmaceutical industries, when we had to produce PPEs by our own, and we were facing the risk of having to depend on imports, and then the borders are locked. And we turn around quickly, produce some domestically. What other stuff can we look at that we can produce domestically? That could be import substituting, that could employ a number of people, sustain income levels. I think those are where the focus should be. Again, we should be looking at targeting agriculture also. So because ultimately, buoyant, but people are eating anywhere. What do we need to sustain the food supply chain so that we avoid spikes in prices and then ultimately going into starvation and all of that because we can't supply now? So targeted solutions to key sectors that can actually turn around quickly is what I think the recovery plan should be focusing now.
And if you could just do this in 30 seconds for me, just because you also mentioned the MPC rate, you're saying that you expect the central bank to hold at the current rate. How about businesses who are looking for reliefs further? Do you think it will be out of the ordinary to sort of want to reduce the policy rate?
You see, the argument will always be there, but the point is this: yes, the previous MPC did not only cut the policy rate by 150 basis points, they also came with a lot of, you would call it unconventional policy actions. I mean, reducing the, what do you call it, the required reserve ratio, and then all those other stuff that came with it, which frees liquidity into the system. In addition to that, the Bank of Ghana arranged with these banks to make available some 3 billion in credits. To what extent has those monies been dispersed? It is actually leading to increased liquidity in the system. I mean, is this time to cut the policy rate further to further increase the liquidity when those monies have not been deployed? They haven't been deployed because banks may be wary of high NPLs and all of that. I do not think the most urgent thing now is easing liquidity in the system.
Okay, Karij Boti, thanks very much indeed for your perspective this afternoon. We appreciate it as always.